There are truths in history that were never meant to be written down. Whispers of private lives, hidden behind closed doors, too intimate for the church, too ordinary for the chroniclers, yet they were real. And tonight, we uncover one of those truths: how women in medieval England experienced desire and solitude, and the secret ways they sought comfort in a world that tried to silence them. Before we begin, I have a humble request. I'm trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. If you enjoy these calming journeys into forgotten history, please subscribe to The Boring Historian. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? I'd love to know. Now let us step quietly into the private history of female masturbation in medieval England. The streets of medieval England were never truly silent. Even at night, when the city gates were shut and the church bells had long since tolled the last hour, life hummed in its quiet way. Dogs barked in distant courtyards. The faint smell of smoke clung to the air. A cartwheel groaned as someone moved goods before dawn. Yet within the stone walls of cottages and manor houses alike, another silence lingered. It was the silence of things unspoken, of longings that could not be shared, of the private moments that, though as human as breathing, never made their way into chronicles or sermons, except as warnings. In this silence lived the ordinary women of England. Some were wives, their marriages arranged not for love, but for land and lineage. Others were widows, left to manage households alone. Many more were peasants, their days consumed with back-breaking labor, their nights spent in shared beds with children or kin. And yet, behind the weight of duty and the watchful eyes of neighbors, desire still stirred. It is a strange thing to consider, that while we know the laws of kings and the battles of knights, the inner lives of medieval women remain almost invisible. The scribes who copied manuscripts cared little for the subtleties of private comfort. The priests who thundered from pulpits spoke only to condemn. And so, when it came to masturbation, to the quiet act of self-pleasure, silence descended. But silence does not mean absence. In fact, it is often in the silence that truth hides most deeply. The very fact that churchmen railed against solitary acts suggests they were known, even common. If women had not sought private relief, there would have been no sin to warn against. Imagine, for a moment, a woman in a small timber-framed cottage. Somewhere in England around the year 1350, her husband is away in the fields, or perhaps already asleep. His snores heavy beside her. Children breathe softly at the hearth. And she, lying awake in the darkness, feels that stirring of the body. Uninvited, unspoken, but insistent. What did she do with that feeling? Could she have reached quietly for herself, as women across history surely have, finding a moment of solace in the loneliness of night? The records do not tell us plainly, yet hints appear at the edges, like the faint outlines of a figure half erased from a page. Confessional guides for priests included questions about solitary acts, not only for men, but for women too. This alone tells us it was not unknown. Medical texts, copied by monks, sometimes described female anatomy with surprising frankness, though always through the lens of humors and balance, never pleasure. And in folk remedies, in whispered advice passed from one woman to another, the body was understood in ways no Latin treatise dared to admit. Still, the act itself was bound by taboo. To touch oneself was to risk the weight of sin. For women, the risk was doubled. Not only a trespass against the church's command, but a threat to the fragile ideal of female chastity. Virginity was prized, obedience expected, silence demanded. For a woman to admit to solitary desire would be to break all three, so the whispers behind closed doors remained just that. Whispers. Glimpses caught only in confessionals, where priests sometimes recorded the shameful admissions of women too honest, or too burdened by guilt to keep silent. A few scattered cases survive in penitential manuals, where questions such as, "Hast thou touched thyself in secret?" reveal the depth of the anxiety. Yet one must imagine that for every woman who confessed, countless others kept their silence. Who would dare to speak? Better to let the moment pass unmentioned, unrecorded, forgotten in daylight, though never truly forgotten in truth. In this way, the private history of masturbation among medieval women was written not in ink, but in silence. It was hidden in the pauses between sermons and the nervous laughter of midwives, in the unspoken knowledge passed quietly between mothers and daughters. It was there, even when the official record denied it. And so, when we look back at medieval England, we must listen not only to the voices of kings and priests, but to the silences of women. For in those silences, whole worlds of experience lay waiting. This, then, is where our journey begins, with the recognition that what is unspoken may be just as real as what is written. Behind closed doors in cottages and castles alike, women lived with bodies that longed, with desires that stirred, and with secrets that could never be openly told. And though the medieval world tried to suppress those whispers, they survived still. Carried across centuries and fragments, if there was one voice that rose louder than all others in medieval England, it was the voice of the church. From the lowliest peasant's cottage to the grandest cathedral, religion shaped daily life. Bells marked the hours, priests guided the rhythms of the seasons, and sermons echoed with warnings about the soul's eternal fate. And when it came to desire, especially solitary desire, the church spoke with clarity, severity, and no small measure of fear. The act of masturbation, though rarely named so directly, was often condemned under broad terms. The sin of lust, the wasting of seed, the indulgence of the flesh. For men, this was tied to the idea of spilling seed without purpose, a violation of the duty to procreate. For women, the condemnation was subtler, but no less harsh. Touching oneself was imagined as giving in to temptation, as opening the body and the mind to sin, and even to demonic influence. In the early centuries of the Middle Ages, penitential manuals, small handbooks, written for confessors, provided lists of sins and the punishments or penances attached to them. Among them were questions aimed at solitary acts. Did the penitent touch themselves in secret? Did they allow lust to overcome them when no partner was present? If so, the penance might be days of fasting, the recitation of dozens of prayers, or, in severe cases, exclusion from communion until the sin was confessed and absolved. For women, such questions carried a double edge. Not only was masturbation condemned as lustful, but it also threatened the ideal of female chastity. A woman was meant to be pure, obedient, modest. To admit to private pleasure was to confess to a kind of independence, a claim over one's own body that the church and society found deeply unsettling. This fear ran deep. Medieval theology was often shaped by the writings of early church fathers such as Augustine, who argued that even the thought of lust outside of marital procreation was sinful. Desire itself, even without action, was a mark of the fall. The lingering curse of Eve, whose temptation in Eden stained all women thereafter. To touch oneself, then, was not only a sin of the flesh, but a reenactment of Eve's disobedience. It was yielding to temptation alone, in silence, but no less dangerous for being unseen. Whispered stories sometimes went further, tying women's solitary acts to witchcraft. If a woman was found with herbs or objects thought strange, suspicion might arise. Was she stirring lust with potions? Was she inviting spirits into her bed? In the fevered imagination of some preachers, even a woman who admitted to touching herself could be seen as dabbling with demons. Pleasure that came from nowhere was sometimes explained as the work of an incubus, a male demon said to visit women in the night. And so, the line between sin and sorcery blurred. Yet ironically, the very effort to condemn masturbation preserved evidence of its existence. In sermons, priests warned their flocks to avoid temptation in private. Manuals for confessors offered long lists of sins that might otherwise go unnoticed. Medical texts, copied in monasteries, sometimes noted that women's bodies could grow restless if not satisfied, though such notes were framed as caution, not permission. Each warning, each prohibition, is like a faint echo across the centuries, telling us that these private acts were indeed known, even common, even if never openly admitted. For ordinary women, this meant living with desire under a constant shadow of fear. Imagine again that woman in her cottage, lying awake at night. She reached for herself in secret. It would not be only comfort she felt, but also guilt. She would know from the priest's sermons that her act was sinful. She might believe that demons lurked nearby, waiting to exploit her weakness. The moment of solace could be followed by hours of silent prayer, whispered pleas for forgiveness, and the gnawing worry that she had endangered her immortal soul. Confession was meant to offer. The church, with its sermons and penitentials, may have spoken with fire and thunder. But it was not the only authority that shaped how people in medieval England understood the human body. Physicians, healers, and writers of learned medicine also offered explanations. Their voices were less moral and more scientific, though filtered through the strange and sometimes bewildering theories of the Middle Ages. And at the center of it all stood the ancient belief in the four humors. According to Galenic medicine, which dominated medieval Europe, the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health came from balance, illness from imbalance. Desire, too, was explained in these terms. A woman who was thought to have too much heat, for example, might be prone to lust. A woman who was too cold or too moist might be sluggish, uninterested, or frigid. The body was a system of balance, and desire was not merely temptation, but a physical condition. Within this framework, female sexuality was often imagined as a problem of retention. Physicians argued that women produced a kind of seed, similar to men, and that this seed, if not released, could build up and cause illness. In other words, it was not only natural, but sometimes necessary for women to experience sexual release. Without it, they risked disease, melancholy, or even suffocation of the womb. This idea gave rise to one of the most famous and troubling concepts in medieval medicine, the wandering womb. Doctors believed that a woman's womb was restless, capable of moving about inside her body. If not satisfied through intercourse, through release, it might drift upwards, pressing against the heart or lungs, causing suffocation, fainting, or hysteria. The womb was imagined as a creature with needs of its own, wandering in search of satisfaction. To our modern ears, this sounds strange, even absurd. Yet it reveals something important. Medieval medicine acknowledged, ever indirectly, that women's bodies carried desire. It was not only a moral problem, but a medical one. Physicians sometimes recommended marriage as a cure for restless women, reasoning that frequent intercourse would balance the humors and satisfy the womb. But in some cases, the remedies were more private. Texts describe midwives or healers using oils, ointments, and manual stimulation as a form of treatment. Though cloaked in medical language, the practice was essentially what we would recognize as assisted masturbation. To calm a woman suffering from womb suffocation, a physician might instruct a midwife to massage her with warmed oil, sometimes even with special instruments. The purpose, they claimed, was to restore balance and expel the seed. But the effect was unmistakably sexual release. Here, then, lies the strange paradox of medieval thought. What the church condemned as sin, medicine sometimes prescribed as cure. For the priest, solitary pleasure was a path to damnation. For the physician, it could be a remedy for hysteria. The woman caught between these two authorities must have felt a profound tension, torn between guilt and relief, between confession and cure. We must also remember that formal physicians were rare and expensive. Most women in England never saw a trained doctor. Their care came from midwives, herbalists, and the wisdom passed down through generations. But even among these women, echoes of the medical theories persisted. They knew that desire was part of the body. They saw that women who lived without affection sometimes grew pale, restless, or melancholy, and they knew, in their own quiet ways, that private release could bring comfort. One can imagine whispered advice, an older woman counseling a younger one, a midwife suggesting a bath with warmed herbs, or even a healer preparing a salve meant to calm the womb. Though the words were careful, though the meaning was cloaked, the truth was understood. The medical texts themselves, copied by monks in scriptoria, offer fascinating glimpses. In some, physicians like Avicenna or Galen were quoted about the necessity of expelling seed. Others included strange recipes, mixtures of honey and herbs to stir desire, or cooling draughts to suppress it. Some warned of excessive stimulation, which they believed could weaken the body. Others recommended frequent satisfaction within marriage as a cure for imbalance. It was a tangle of contradictions. Yet beneath it all lay the unspoken acknowledgement that women's bodies were not silent but responsive, longing, alive. The wandering womb theory in particular left a long shadow. For centuries, If the cloisters of monks echoed with sermons against lust, and the halls of physicians buzzed with theories of humors and wandering wombs, then the cottages, kitchens, and gardens of medieval England whispered a different kind of knowledge. Here, among sprigs of herbs drying in the rafters and bowls of crushed roots resting on wooden tables, women and healers tended to the quiet realities of the body. Herbal medicine in the Middle Ages was a vast and layered world. Every village had at least one woman, sometimes called a wise woman, sometimes a midwife, sometimes merely a good neighbor, who knew which plants eased childbirth, which herbs calmed fevers, and which roots stirred desire. This knowledge was practical, passed down through generations, but it was also shrouded in secrecy. For to speak too boldly about women's pleasure risked drawing suspicion, even accusations of witchcraft. Still, the herbs were there, and they carried meanings. Some plants were thought to cool desire. Lettuce, for example, was believed to dull lust. Monks often ate it, hoping its damp, cooling nature would calm the fires of the flesh. Likewise, water lilies and violets were associated with chastity, their juices mixed into tonics meant to suppress longing. Women seeking to confess less often, or to ease the pangs of guilt, may have sipped such infusions, perhaps brewed under the guise of simple health. But there were also herbs said to stir the body. Fennel, ginger, and mustard seed, with their hot, biting qualities, were believed to excite passion. Spices arriving from the east, cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, were whispered of as aphrodisiacs, their warmth not only filling the belly, but awakening the blood. These were rare luxuries, affordable only to the wealthy. Yet they carried a reputation that reached even the poor, who dreamed of their powers. Closer to home, humbler plants also played their part. Parsley was thought to provoke menstruation, and by extension, stir desire. Rue, a bitter herb, was sometimes used both to prevent pregnancy and to awaken passion. A paradoxical role that speaks to how tangled the knowledge of herbs could be. Charms, too, entered the picture. Some women wore amulets of certain stones, believed to temper lust, or in other cases, to inflame it. Others kept small pouches filled with herbs close to the skin, like a secret pact with nature. The boundaries between medicine and magic were porous. What mattered was not only the plant itself, but the ritual, the belief, the whispered word spoken as it was prepared. In this way, remedies for desire were deeply personal. A woman might brew a calming tea when her heart was restless. She might anoint herself with a scented oil to bring sleep or to bring pleasure. None of this would have been spoken of openly. Yet in kitchens lit by firelight, in gardens enclosed by hedges, the knowledge lived on. We also find traces of this in manuscripts, not only in the learned Latin of physicians, but in vernacular recipe books. Some household guides included instructions for cooling the body or stirring the womb. The language was careful, often cloaked in euphemism, but the intention was plain. Even among the literate elite, there was recognition that herbs could move the passions. Of course, this knowledge carried danger. A woman too skilled in herbs could be admired as a healer or feared as a witch. When accusations of witchcraft rose in the later Middle Ages, many centered around women said to make love potions, fertility charms, or filters of desire. The line between midwife and sorceress was thin, and it often depended less on what she did and more on who her neighbors were and whether they trusted her. Yet despite these risks, the remedies continued. Why? Because desire is part of life. Husbands wanted their wives fertile. Wives wanted to ease their bodies. Lovers sought to stir one another's passion. And in the quiet of everyday life, far from the eyes of priests, the simplest way to tend to such things was through plants and potions. Imagine for a moment a medieval woman standing in her garden at dusk. She bends to gather mint for her kitchen, but she also plucks a sprig of rue, tucking it into her pouch. Perhaps she will steep it in warm water. When we speak of desire in medieval times, we must remember this was a world without modern devices, without products openly marketed for intimacy, without even the language to discuss such things without shame. And yet, the body's needs remained. Where desire stirred, women turned to what was near at hand. In kitchens, in bedchambers, in warm baths, the ordinary objects of daily life sometimes became instruments of secret comfort. The evidence for this is fragmentary. Medieval chroniclers almost never wrote openly about women's self-pleasure, and when they did, it was usually in the tone of scandal or condemnation. But between the margins, in scattered texts, and through the lens of common sense, we can imagine how the most ordinary items might have found extraordinary use. Take, for example, the wooden tools of the household. A pestle for grinding grain, a smooth-handled spoon, even a spindle used for spinning thread. All objects carved from wood, often polished with handling until they gleamed. These were the everyday tools of women's labor, held daily in hand, shaped to fit the palm. In moments of solitude, when the house was still, such objects may have been turned to other uses, a familiar weight becoming a source of private relief. Vegetables, too, carried their quiet possibilities. Cucumbers, carrots, parsnips, simple produce from the garden or market, were occasionally mentioned in medical and moral texts, usually as warnings. Some writers cautioned women against keeping such items near their beds. The very fact that warnings were issued hints at realities too widespread to ignore. After all, if something was feared, it was usually because it happened often enough to be noticed. Then there was cloth. Textiles filled every medieval home. Wool, linen, scraps of soft fabric. A rolled piece of cloth, tied with string, could be shaped as needed, perhaps used in the privacy of a bed. Cloth was both accessible and deniable. If discovered, it could always be explained away as nothing more than rags for household use. Such improvisations were practical, discreet, and safe in a world where secrecy mattered above all else. Bathing, too, played a role. Though medieval people did not bathe as frequently as we do today, baths were not unknown, especially among the wealthy or in urban bathhouses. Warm water itself could be a source of pleasure and relaxation. Imagine the rare luxury of slipping into a heated tub, scented perhaps with herbs, the steam rising. A woman alone might linger, using the water not only for cleansing but for quiet release. Even streams, rivers, or secluded pools may have offered such moments, nature itself providing a discreet refuge. Some of the most fascinating clues come from the accusations of the Church. Priests' manuals and penitential texts warned women against using certain objects in shameful ways. The language was vague, but it points to practices that priests knew or suspected were occurring. In their attempt to control women's private lives, they revealed inadvertently that these private acts existed. Beyond household tools and foods, there is also the question of toys or objects made for pleasure. Quietly outside the eyes of authority, though no medieval catalogs of such things survive, there are scattered references. In certain courts of Europe, rumors spoke of carved phallic objects, sometimes described in trials or satirical poems. Whether used by married women in their husband's absence, or by widows, or by women alone. Such items must have been rare, treasured, and hidden carefully away. The secrecy of these objects was vital. Discovered pestle or carved toy could mean nothing, or it could mean everything, depending on who found it. For all the richness of medieval writing, the chronicles of kings and battles, the sermons of priests, the romances of knights and ladies, there is an extraordinary quiet when it comes to the subject of women's private desires. It is not simply that little was written, it is that a deliberate silence seems to hover, as if chroniclers, scholars, and moralists had agreed that some truths were better left unwritten. This silence is, in itself, revealing. In a world where monks recorded the shape of every miracle, where physicians listed every bodily fluid, where poets described the pangs of courtly love in elaborate detail, why did they stop short at women's solitary pleasure? The answer lies partly in discomfort. Medieval culture was deeply shaped by Christianity, and in the eyes of the Church, masturbation was a sin, a dangerous act of self-indulgence that turned one's gaze away from God. For men, it was condemned as spilling seed. For women, it was even harder to name, because the female body was already seen as mysterious, unruly, and threatening when unchecked. To admit that women might seek pleasure alone was to admit that they had autonomy over their own bodies. And that was a deeply unsettling thought in a patriarchal society, so the texts chose silence. Instead of naming these acts, priests and scholars wrote around them, using vague terms. Sin of the flesh, solitary vice, immodest touching. Manuals of confession, the penitentials, sometimes hinted at the possibility of women engaging in such acts. But the language was brief, hesitant, and always framed in condemnation. It is as if the writers wanted to acknowledge enough to warn confessors, but not enough to dwell on the reality. The silence also reveals what was considered worthy of record: kings' battles, saints' miracles, noble romances. These were fit for parchment, ink, and preservation. The private acts of women in cottages, or even noble chambers, were not. Their lives, their desires, their hidden moments were considered too ordinary, too shameful, or too destabilizing to the established order. By omitting them, chroniclers reinforced the illusion that such things did not happen, or at least did not matter. But silence can be as eloquent as speech. The very absence of detail suggests that the reality was widespread enough to trouble the men who shaped the written record. Why warn against sin unless people were committing it? Why issue confessional guidelines unless confessors were hearing such admissions? The lack of narrative, in fact, highlights the persistence of the practice. Women did not stop being human simply because the texts chose not to see them. What we find instead are shadows, some medical note about women's excessive heat, a passing warning about objects used in indecent ways, a confessor's handbook urging priests to ask women if they had touched themselves immodestly. These fragments do not tell full stories, but they open cracks in the silence. Through them, we glimpse the reality hidden just beyond the page. It is also telling that where the subject does appear, it is usually in the context of anxiety. Chroniclers worried about the fragility of morality, the dangers of temptation, the corruption of souls. Women's solitary pleasure was not described with curiosity or sympathy, but with dread. The fear was not only of sin, but of disorder, that women might find fulfillment outside of marriage, outside of men, outside of the structures meant to contain them. Thus, the silence of the texts is not neutral. It is a silence shaped by power, by men who controlled literacy, who chose what was written and preserved, who decided which aspects of life were worth remembering. The chronicles of monks fell silent on women's private lives. The poets of castles and courts spun a very different kind of tale. For in the world of courtly love, desire was not ignored. It was exalted, adorned, and celebrated in verse. Knights pined for unattainable ladies, troubadours sang of secret passions, lovers whispered their longing through poetry and song. Though such tales rarely touched on solitary intimacy, they painted landscapes of desire that could not help but stir the imagination. And in those private spaces of thought, where no priest or chronicler could intrude, women's fantasies were born. The culture of courtly love emerged in medieval Europe around the 12th century and spread widely by the 13th and 14th. It was a set of ideals, a literary tradition, and a social performance, particularly in aristocratic circles. Its themes were consistent. A noble knight devoted himself to a lady, often unattainable because she was married, or of higher rank, or bound by duty. The knight pledged service to her, endured trials for her sake, and found joy in the mere sight of her hand or smile. For women, these stories were double-edged. On one hand, they placed women on pedestals, making them the object of devotion, the muse, the prize. On the other, they still confined women to roles defined by male desire. Yet within this tradition, something important happened. Women were acknowledged as beings who inspired longing. Their beauty, their presence, their very existence were seen as powerful. Imagine a young noblewoman in her chamber, a candle burning low as she listens to a troubadour sing beneath her window. The song tells of a knight who cannot sleep, who dreams of his lady, who lives only for her glance. She feels a thrill, not because she believes every word, but because the song tells her something she already knows, but rarely hears aloud, that she is desirable, that her body and spirit are worthy of passion. Later, as she lies in her bed, those words linger. Perhaps in her imagination, she becomes the lady of the song, inspiring a knight's devotion. Perhaps she even lets the fantasy move beyond the song, into a private act of comfort that no one will ever know. Even among women who could not read, these tales traveled. Songs, poems, romances, they were performed aloud, recited in halls, sung in markets. The stories of Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere. and countless unnamed knights and ladies reached ears beyond the aristocracy. For peasant women, the tales may have been distant, idealized, but still they carried the spark of possibility. They offered visions of passion, of longing, of bodies caught up in desire, things that everyday life bound by labor and duty. In the hidden corners of medieval life, where men's words filled the parchments and priests' voices filled the pulpits, women found their own ways of sharing truths. One of the most powerful networks for such knowledge was the circle of midwives, healers, and elder women, those who tended to births, illnesses, and the mysteries of the female body. In an age when official texts fell silent about women's private needs, these women became living libraries, carrying whispered traditions from one generation to the next. A midwife might visit a young wife not only to help her through labor, but to teach her herbs for easing pain, teas for calming nerves, or oils to soothe the restless stirrings of desire. A healer might know which plants heightened warmth in the blood, or which balms provided comfort when sleeplessness set in. Though no manuscript openly declared such uses, it is hard to imagine these women, with their deep familiarity with the body, as being entirely ignorant of ways women sought relief when solitude became heavy. These circles were also safe havens for confession. A girl newly married, frightened by her husband's absence during long journeys, might speak in hushed tones to her mother or aunt. An older woman, with decades of wisdom, might give a knowing smile and a discreet suggestion. In a world where men often define sin and shame, these private exchanges allowed women to reclaim some ownership of their desires, however quietly. The secrets shared among women were not written in ink, but they endured. They passed in kitchens, in birthing rooms, and in the stillness of candlelit evenings, a kind of underground history. Feminine and fragile, yet powerful enough to survive where official records refused to speak. If there is one thread that runs darkly through the history of women's private lives in the Middle Ages, it is the weight of shame. Shame was not just an inner feeling. It was a tool, sharpened and wielded by both religion and culture, meant to bind desire in silence. From the pulpit, priests warned that even a passing thought of lust was dangerous. To act upon it alone, in secrecy, was cast as an act against God himself. For women, who were already viewed as weaker, more susceptible to temptation, the burden was doubled. They were told their bodies were vessels of sin, prone to corruption, and that any stirring within them was not natural but wicked. This message seeped into daily life. Imagine a young woman, perhaps married, but left alone while her husband traveled for trade or war. She might feel the warmth of desire stir within her, an entirely human sensation, but with it came a crushing flood of guilt. The voices of priests echoed in her mind, warning of eternal punishment, of devils whispering in the dark. Even if she dared to give herself a moment of relief, it could be followed by long hours of kneeling on cold stone floors, whispering prayers for forgiveness. The act itself was fleeting, but the guilt lingered like a shadow. Shame also shaped silence. Women rarely, if ever, spoke of such private moments, not even to their closest companions, for fear of judgment. This silence made it easy for the church to maintain control, because each woman believed her own struggle was uniquely sinful.
out.
Not realizing how common such experiences were, the isolation was part of the shame, a quiet prison that kept women apart from one another in their most vulnerable truths. And yet, desire did not vanish simply because shame was pressed upon it. Women lived with this tension, the body's natural pull on one side, and the heavy hand of religious condemnation on the other. For some, shame silenced action entirely. For others, the shame became part of the act itself, an unavoidable weight they carried in secret. The weight of shame was not only spiritual, it bled into how women viewed themselves, their worth, and their relationship with their own bodies. To be told again and again that one's natural impulses were sinful was to learn. The convent was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where women could retreat from the distractions of the world and devote themselves entirely to God, behind cloistered walls. Nuns lived under vows of poverty, obedience, chastity, three pillars that defined not only their external lives, but also their inner battles. Yet within these spaces of prayer and silence, human desire did not suddenly vanish. Flesh does not forget its nature simply because it is cloaked in a habit. And so, the convent became one of the most paradoxical spaces in medieval Europe, a place where vows of chastity were most exalted, yet where the struggles of desire often became the most acute. The writings of medieval confessors and clerics reveal glimpses of this paradox. Priests recorded anxieties about the temptations of solitude that nuns faced when removed from men's company. Far from eliminating desire, some argued the cloister intensified it. Women who spent hours in quiet prayer, fasting, and self-denial often reported visions, dreams, or stirrings they feared were not divine but bodily. To a medieval confessor, a nun whispering her temptations might seem to be struggling with the devil's tricks. But to us, centuries later, it is clear that many were simply describing the natural pulse of human longing in an environment that allowed no safe expression of it. Scandals occasionally surfaced. Chronicles speak often in tones of outrage about nuns caught breaking vows, sometimes with priests, sometimes with one another, and sometimes in solitary acts that were confessed under duress. These accounts were usually framed as cautionary tales, proof of sin and corruption in supposedly holy places. But beneath the moralizing language, they reveal something striking, even behind convent walls. Women wrestled with the same inner lives as their counterparts beyond them. Daily routines inside convents could sharpen this tension. Hours of silence left nuns with only their thoughts. Harsh fasting weakened the body, yet heightened its sensitivities. Marriage in the medieval world was rarely the union of two souls in love. For most women, especially outside the rare world of courtly romance, marriage was a contract, an arrangement decided by fathers, lords, or guardians, more about property, dowries, and alliances than affection. A girl might be married off at 14 or 15, often to a man much older, sometimes a stranger she had only met briefly before the ceremony. Her duty was to serve, to bear children, to manage the household, and to embody obedience. The expectation of love was, more often than not, a luxury she would never know. For women trapped in such unions, loneliness could be suffocating. Some husbands were absent for long stretches of time, away on campaigns, pilgrimages, or trade journeys. Others were emotionally absent, even when physically present, treating their wives as little more than vessels for heirs. And some were cruel, demanding submission without tenderness. In these circumstances, women were left with their own thoughts, their own longings, and the gnawing ache of unmet affection. Private acts of comfort became a hidden way to reclaim something of themselves. These moments were not framed in terms of modern ideas of self-care or empowerment, but rather as fleeting escapes from an unyielding life. A woman lying alone in a cold bedchamber might find her imagination drifting, recalling a troubadour song of romance, or a fleeting glance from a kind-faced neighbor at market. She might reach for ordinary objects, soft cloth, or even simply the warmth of her own hands, drawing some brief solace in the only intimacy she could control. Yet this comfort was shadowed by guilt. To a woman raised in the shadow of sermons warning of eternal damnation, the act of turning inward could feel like betrayal, not only to God, but to her absent husband, even if he showed her no tenderness. The paradox was painful. The very thing that gave a moment's relief also fed the cycle of shame that followed. Still, the pull of human need was stronger than doctrine alone. And so, many women likely carried on these quiet rituals, never speaking of them, never confessing them, keeping them locked within their own solitude. Some found subtler ways of coping. A married woman might throw herself into household duties with obsessive devotion, exhausting her body so that desire would be drowned in fatigue. Others might turn to prayer, asking God to remove the temptation, though such prayers ironically kept the thought alive in their minds. Some, emboldened by desperation, allowed themselves to give in, seeking brief comfort in private moments that no one could witness. What is striking is how common this quiet loneliness must have been. Across villages and cities, castles and cottages, countless women shared the same ache, yet believed themselves alone in it. Each thought her longing a unique weakness, never realizing it was part of a shared, unspoken experience of womanhood in the Middle Ages. The walls of arranged marriage, the silence of shame, and the absence of affection created a world where private solace was not only natural, but in many cases, the only refuge left. Thus, in the shadow of loveless marriages, hidden acts of intimacy became a quiet rebellion, a reminder that even when denied affection, a woman's body still spoke its truth. And though the church might condemn, though culture might shame, those stolen moments of comfort gave medieval women a fragile but vital measure of control over their own inner lives. In the vast tapestry of medieval society, class shaped nearly every aspect of life, from the food on one's table to the clothes on one's back, to the freedoms or lack thereof that a woman could enjoy. Yet when it came to private intimacy, to the unspoken moments of solitude, both noble women and peasant women shared a strikingly similar burden: secrecy. Their lives were separated by wealth, status, and power, but the human body does not heed such divisions. Desire stirred in the bedchamber of the castle as surely as it did in the hut of the village. The difference lay not in the existence of that desire, but in how it was hidden, controlled, or expressed. For the noblewoman, life was lived in near constant scrutiny. A lady of the manor was rarely left alone. Servants attended to her chamber. Companions followed her walks. Her movements were often dictated by the expectations of her husband and household. Privacy was a luxury she could scarcely afford. And yet, within those stone walls, longing still found its way into her heart. A noblewoman might read tales of courtly love, where gallant knights pined for unattainable ladies. And such poetry could awaken a yearning that her arranged marriage could not fulfill. If she turned inward for comfort, she did so under the heavy risk of discovery, for a noblewoman being caught could mean scandal, disgrace, or accusations of sin that might ripple far beyond her chamber. Thus, her solitude was carefully guarded, a secret rebellion against the constant gaze of her world. The peasant woman's life was different, yet not freer. Her days were filled with labor, tending fields, carrying water, preparing food, and caring for children. Unlike the noblewoman, she lacked the constant attention of servants. But privacy was still scarce in small, cramped cottages shared with family members. A moment of solitude might come only late at night, after her household was asleep, or in the quiet of the fields, when no one was watching. For her, private intimacy was not wrapped in poetry or romance, but in practicality, an instinctive act of comfort amid hardship. Might use whatever was at hand: cloth, simple tools, or merely her own body, finding solace before another day of toil began. Despite these differences, secrecy united both women. The noble woman concealed her solitude from servants, confessors, and family, while the peasant woman hid hers from her neighbors and kin. Both carried the weight of shame, though shaped by their stations. The noble woman's shame was tied to reputation and family honor, while the peasant woman's was rooted in sin and survival. Yet both learned to live with silence, believing themselves alone in their struggles, even though countless women across both classes shared the same unspoken truth. It is striking to consider how, in these divided worlds, women might have crossed paths. A lady and her maid, a mistress and her servant, perhaps exchanging unspoken glances that hinted at knowledge neither could put into words. A servant who bathed her mistress would know more than she was allowed to say. A lady who observed her maid's exhaustion might guess at the hidden struggles of her life. Though separated by class, they were united by the same secret humanity. The body asked quiet insistence on its own needs, and the secrecy required to answer them. Thus, whether in a candlelit chamber draped with fine linens or a straw-filled cot in a peasantess hut, the story was the same. The lady and the servant lived in different worlds, yet both carried their desires in silence. Both sought their own fleeting moments of comfort, and both hid their humanity behind the veil of secrecy that medieval society demanded. If there was one place where the private burdens of women occasionally surfaced, it was within the darkened space of the confessional. The confessional was meant to be a sacred refuge, a place where sins could be spoken aloud and absolution granted. But for medieval women, it was also one of the only spaces where the unspoken truths of their private lives could slip through silence, even if only in whispers. And here, too, we find some of the rarest traces of how female self-pleasure was viewed. Recorded not in women's own words, but in the manuals and guides written for priests. Confession was a deeply personal ritual. A woman might kneel before her confessor, separated by a screen, her voice hushed as she revealed the stirrings of her conscience. Some would speak of gossip, disobedience, or missed prayers. But sometimes shame drove them to confess the secret acts they had hidden, even from themselves. The restless nights, the private touches, the fantasies that would not leave their minds. For the priest, such confessions were expected because church law had grown increasingly detailed about sexual sin. By the 13th century, confessional guides known as penitentials listed a wide array of forbidden acts, and among them were fleeting references to women's solitary pleasure. These references are scarce, but significant. A handful of manuals warned priests to inquire carefully about whether women had touched themselves in solitude, whether they had used objects for stimulation, or whether they had entertained lustful thoughts. The very presence of such questions in these guides suggests that women were confessing these things, that such acts were not as rare as silence in chronicles would lead us to believe. The church would not have crafted questions for confessors. unless there was a reality they were trying to address. The punishments, too, hint at the depth of fear surrounding female desire. Some penitentials suggested long fasts, repeated prayers, or even pilgrimages as penance for these confessions. Others treated the acts as forms of uncleanliness that had to be cleansed before a woman could return to communion. A few went further, implying that such women were more susceptible to the devil's influence, that their bodies were gateways to sin. For women hearing these responses, the effect must have been devastating. What they had turned to for comfort and solitude now became a source of crushing guilt, reinforced by the very men they sought forgiveness from. Yet in these whispered confessions, something important is revealed. Women did speak, if only in rare moments, if only under the weight of fear. Their voices were filtered through the priests who recorded them. But the reality of their private lives emerges in fragments. Each confession, each stern warning preserved in the margins of a manual, is a faint echo of countless women who carried the same struggles. The confessional was both prison and release. To speak was to risk shame and penance, but to remain silent was to carry the burden alone. And so, many women must have stood on the edge of confession, torn between silence and disclosure, between the hope of absolution and the fear of condemnation. It is within these whispered moments, preserved by the very institution that sought to suppress them, that we glimpse the truth. Medieval women did not live free of desire. They lived under its weight, under the shadow of shame, yet with enough courage to whisper their secrets, trusting that even in sin, they might be heard. For medieval women, the greatest terror of their private lives was not the act itself, but the imagined weight of its consequences. From the church's pulpit to the whispered warnings of mothers and midwives, women were told again and again that touching their own bodies was not a harmless indulgence, but a mortal danger, a sin that stained the soul, a temptation that opened the door to devils, and a threat that could unravel both their salvation and their reputation. The church made its position brutally clear. To indulge in solitary pleasure was to place one's soul at risk of eternal damnation. Priests warned that every act would be remembered at the final judgment, every hidden sin laid bare before the eyes of God. For women, who were already cast as daughters of Eve, forever associated with temptation and weakness, this was a crushing burden. To surrender to their own desires was to confirm what men already believed, that they were morally fragile, easily corrupted, and in need of constant control. Confessional manuals intensified this fear. A woman who dared admit to such acts might be assigned long fasts, painful penances, or humiliating pilgrimages as punishment. These were not just spiritual burdens, but public ones. A neighbor who noticed her absence at meals, or a fellow villager who saw her walking barefoot to a shrine, might begin to wonder what secret sin weighed upon her. In a world where gossip traveled faster than parchment ink, even the smallest hint could spiral into lasting shame. Beyond spiritual consequence lay the social dangers. If a husband discovered his wife's secret, he might accuse her not only of sin, but of dishonoring his household. If a servant whispered rumors of her lady's private habits, the scandal could ruin reputations, particularly for noble women whose lives were already watched closely. For peasant women, the risk could be crueler still. Accusations of lewdness or even witchcraft, especially if they were already on the margins of society. In a culture where unexplained behavior often bred suspicion, private acts of intimacy could be reimagined as pacts with the devil. Perhaps most terrifying of all was the inward fear, the voices of conscience that haunted women after such acts. Alone in the dark, a woman might feel the sudden rush of guilt, imagining demons watching her, angels turning away, Christ's sorrowful eyes upon her. These fears were not abstract. They were lived realities, shaped by sermons, penances, and the constant drumbeat of moral instruction. The body's brief comfort was followed by hours, even days, of torment. A cycle of desire and dread that left many women exhausted in both flesh and spirit. And yet, despite all these fears, the acts persisted. Human nature cannot be scolded away, nor can the body's needs be erased by shame. The very fact that priests, confessors, and chroniclers warned so fiercely against women's solitary pleasure suggests that it happened often. In a world where science was scarce and superstition was abundant, medieval women's private longings were often explained not as natural human impulses, but as the work of unseen spirits. Folklore became a framework through which society tried to understand what it could not comfortably acknowledge: that women, too, felt desire. Rather than admit this openly, people wove stories of demons, witches, and wandering spirits who supposedly crept into bedchambers at night, stirring sinful thoughts in the hearts of women. One of the most enduring tales was that of the incubus, a male demon said to visit women as they slept, pressing upon them with lustful intentions. For women who awoke from dreams of desire, the incubus was a convenient explanation. Their bodies had responded naturally, yet blame could be shifted outward, onto a supernatural invader.
Ow.
The church reinforced these beliefs, warning that the devil sought entry through the weakness of women's flesh. In truth, what may have been no more than a dream or private touch was reframed as evidence of demonic temptation. Folklore also offered gentler, though still fantastical, explanations. In some regions, women spoke of love spirits, or wandering fairies, that stirred yearning in lonely hearts. Rural superstitions held that herbs gathered on certain nights could attract or soothe these spirits, influencing desire itself. A woman who felt restless longing might be told she had been touched by the night air or bewitched by an unseen charm, though not as sinister as the incubus. These stories still placed responsibility outside the woman herself, avoiding the scandal of admitting her own natural urges. For midwives and healers, superstition could be both a shield and a tool. If a woman came to them, confessing unspoken desires, they might prescribe herbs under the guise of warding off spirits or calming the womb. These remedies often carried dual meanings, outwardly medical or spiritual, but privately understood as ways to ease the pull of longing. The persistence of these stories shows how deeply uncomfortable medieval society was with female desire. It was easier to believe that a demon crept through a window than to admit that a woman, alone in her chamber, might seek her own comfort. Folklore allowed people to speak of what they could not name directly, covering natural truths with a cloak of superstition. Yet for women themselves, these tales were doubled. They provided an excuse. It was not me, it was the incubus, but also a source of terror. A woman who indulged in private acts might lie awake afterward, heart pounding, convinced that a demon had claimed her body. In this way, folklore amplified shame, binding desire not only to sin, but also to fear of the supernatural. Still, behind the demons and fairies, the truth remained. As the Middle Ages wore on, something curious happened. What the pulpit condemned as sin, the physician began to treat as illness. Desire, especially women's desire, was reinterpreted not only as a moral failing, but as a medical condition, something to be soothed, regulated, and in the eyes of learned men, controlled through the tools of their trade. This shift from purely spiritual condemnation to medical explanation did not liberate women from shame. Rather, it wrapped their private struggles in new layers of diagnosis, treatment, and intervention.
Ow.
Medieval medical thought was shaped by the ancient theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, it was believed, depended on keeping these fluids in balance. Female bodies, according to physicians, were especially prone to imbalance. Women were thought to be colder and wetter by nature, vulnerable to excess moisture that could cause restlessness, hysteria, and what physicians often referred to as the wandering womb. When women reported feelings of tension, unease, or longing, doctors sometimes described these sensations not as sin, but as physical disorder. In their eyes, the body itself demanded release. And so, physicians prescribed remedies, though their remedies often blurred the line between medicine and stimulation. Oils infused with warming herbs like saffron or cinnamon were suggested for cool wombs and sluggish blood. Baths in heated water with salts or perfumed flowers were said to open the passages and calm agitation. Some physicians even described a massage of the lower abdomen, by a midwife or healer, never by the woman herself, as a way to restore balance. In essence, What the church feared as sinful pleasure, medicine reframed as therapeutic necessity. Tools, too, entered the picture. While explicit devices are rarely mentioned in surviving texts, there are scattered hints of objects used for stimulation under the guise of treatment. Early descriptions of hollowed gourds, ivory rods, or oiled instruments appear in medical manuscripts, often couched in clinical language. These were not called toys or tools of pleasure, but remedies to expel excess humors or relieve congestion of the womb. Yet it requires little imagination to see how these so-called treatments overlapped with private acts of comfort women had long discovered on their own. The medicalization of female desire reveals both progress and control. On the one hand, it acknowledged, however clumsily, that women's bodies had needs. On the other, it placed those needs firmly in the hands of male doctors, stripping women of ownership over their own experiences. By framing pleasure as illness, medicine turned natural desire into a problem requiring intervention. Women who might have secretly soothed themselves were now told they must be treated by others, further deepening the sense of shame and dependency. Yet for all the strangeness of these medical texts, they leave behind invaluable evidence. Women's longing was real, common, and undeniable. No physician would have bothered to invent such remedies, unless he was responding to complaints voiced by his patients. The fact that these remedies existed shows that female desire could not be erased. No matter how hard the church tried to condemn it, or how eagerly medicine tried to pathologize it. Thus, in the medicalization of pleasure, we glimpse a new chapter of the same story. Desire was never a story of women's secret desires in the Middle Ages is not told in bold letters or clear voices. It survives instead as faint whispers, half-erased scribbles in the margins of manuscripts, veiled lines in medical notes, or as scattered phrases in the stern language of confession manuals. Unlike the poetry of knights and kings, unlike the chronicles of battles or the illuminated pages celebrating saints, the record of female self-pleasure lies hidden in fragments. Its very absence, its silence, is itself a kind of presence, a shadow that lingers in history. Confessional guides provide some of the clearest but most cautious glimpses. Priests were trained to question penitents with precision, and manuals written for confessors listed sins in exhaustive detail. Occasionally, within these long lists of human weakness, we find passing references to unnatural acts, self-pollution, or sin against nature. Rarely were women singled out, but their inclusion is implied, sometimes hinted at by a carefully chosen Latin phrase. These texts do not describe, they condemn. Yet the fact that such sins need to be confessed at all tells us that they happened often enough to warrant instruction. Behind the silence of the page, we hear the faint echo of women whispering their private acts to priests in darkened booths, their secrets pressed into the folds of parchment. Medical notes give us another layer of the story. Physicians wrote of female restlessness, of stirrings of the womb, of congested humors. And in these phrases we catch traces of what was never said directly. Women described sensations to doctors. Doctors translated them into clinical language. And in those translations, though the voice of the woman is muffled, it is not entirely lost. Her complaint is preserved, if only through the filter of male interpretation. Even in literature, we sometimes glimpse desire through allegory. A tale of a maiden longing for a knight, a nun's vision of ecstatic union with Christ. A fable of a woman bewitched by spirits. All could be read beneath the surface as metaphors of bodily yearning. Here, the silence is not empty, but filled with coded speech. Medieval women, like their male counterparts, lived in a culture of metaphor and symbol. Desire often slipped through in disguise. What is striking is how this silence itself endured across centuries. Archives, the fragments rest quietly, a marginal note, a physician's aside, a confessor's caution. They are easy to overlook, almost designed to be forgotten. And yet, when gathered together, they reveal a truth that could not be erased. Women's private acts may not have been openly discussed, but they left ripples on the surface of culture, enough to remind us that behind the silence was always life, always experience. The echoes of silence are perhaps more powerful than loud proclamations. They remind us of the resilience of human desire, of its ability to endure even when denied, condemned, or pathologized. Silence was not absence. It was survival. And so, in these faint fragments, we hear the unspoken chorus of countless women whose voices never reached the page, but whose lives were full of longing nonetheless. And so, we arrive at the quiet close of this long, hidden story, the story of medieval women, desire, and the ways in which silence wrapped itself around their most private moments. What we have uncovered together is not a tale told in bold ink, but one pieced together from shadows, from whispers, from fragments. Yet in these small clues, we see a larger truth about humanity itself. That desire, no matter how much it is condemned, hidden, or repressed, is an inseparable part of being human. Medieval women lived in a world where their bodies were seen not as their own, but as vessels of family honor, tools for childbirth, or objects of moral judgment. And yet, in the secret stillness of the night, behind closed doors, or in moments stolen between duties, they remained themselves, with thoughts, with longings, with flesh that demanded to be acknowledged. The fact that we cannot hear their voices directly does not erase them. In many ways, it makes them feel closer, like a breath we sense in the dark, just beyond hearing. This forgotten history reminds us of the resilience of women in every age. They carried burdens of shame, fears of sin, threats of punishment, yet still, they found ways to live. In the hush of convent dormitories, in the loneliness of arranged marriages, in the silence of peasant cottages, in the guarded chambers of noble halls, women reached for comfort, for relief, for small fragments of intimacy with themselves. These moments, though invisible to official history, mattered deeply in their lived reality. To reflect on this subject is to recognize that history is never only what is written down. It is also what is hidden, what is whispered, what is left unsaid. And sometimes, those silences speak the loudest truths. They tell us of universality, that across time, people have felt the same needs, the same tensions between body and spirit, between desire and restraint. That continuity is in itself comforting. It means that even in the Middle Ages, with all their distance from us, human beings were not so different after all. So tonight, as you let your eyes grow heavy, take this history not as scandal, but as a soft reminder of how deep and timeless intimacy is. It is not just the grand stories of kings or the stern laws of priests that define humanity. It is also these quiet, hidden, personal truths. They are fragile, but they are real. And with that, I thank you for spending this time here, listening, reflecting, and wandering through the forgotten corridors of the past. If you are here at the end, I offer you my gratitude and a humble reminder if you can. Please help me reach my small goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your presence here already means more than words can say. Now, wherever you are, whether it is late at night, the middle of the afternoon, or the early hours of dawn, may this story have brought you calm, to gentle rhythm, to ease you toward rest. And so, softly, we close the book on this tale of silence and longing. Until we meet again, may you find peace in the stillness of your own night. Good night.